in 2018. In 2018, when I was studying at Longwood Gardens, she taught the native plant class, as well as one of her cohorts who focused on the meadow. Pandora focused on Peirce's woods. So let me tell you who she is. Pandora is a senior landscape stewardship and ecology technician. She was promoted to that in the last year. She spent 18 years as the horticulturalist for Peirce's woods, which, for those of you who've been there, is this gorgeous woodland with the most amazing native plants and all sorts of interesting ways of creating cultures and so forth, which she's going to teach us about tonight as well. She had her BA in Japanese studies, but she had a minor in biology, which I think is fascinating. Someday Pandora will have to learn more about how Japanese studies has helped you in your career. And then over the years, she's taught many classes, the ones I've been to. You do the edible plants class at Longwood as well. And she's really passionate about connecting people and plants and fostering healthy ecosystems. So Pandora, I'm going to turn it over to you. And I hope everybody enjoys it. Remember, chat is for you folks to talk to one another. Use the Q&A if you have a question that you'd like me to answer or help guide the Q&A at the end with Pandora. Okay. Take it away, Pandora.
All right, Bobby, thank you for that introduction. And I'm going to have to tune back in next month. Sam Hoadley worked with me back in the day when he first started at Longwood as a student, and he's a delight. So I'd recommend tuning in next month as well. So without further ado, let's get into home landscapes for our changing future. I want you to know a little bit about where I'm coming from. If you haven't visited Longwood or you don't know the site's history, the land use history of the area in Kennett Square where Longwood Gardens is dates back thousands of years. The Lenni Lenape people, we don't have records about how they moved plants around, but they probably did. And starting in the 1700s is when land was cleared for agriculture. George Peirce purchased the property, and an arboretum began in 1798. So that's when plant introductions of both trees from all over North America as well as from abroad began coming to the land. And in 1906, Mr. Pierre S. DuPont purchased about 200 acres to save it from being cut for lumber. So this is an aerial view of the property today, over 1,000 acres, and we get about 1.6 million guests annually. So to put this in a framework of thinking about the site, it is not a pristine, untouched wilderness. It has been, it's had plants added to it for a long time, and had much like a home garden. Plants from all over the world. So our current living accessions include almost 2,000 genre of plants and over 6,000 species. So from the plants in our over 80 acres of meadows with trails for our guests, and to our 1,000 bloom mum in our conservatory. So I'm going to take us through this fairly quickly. The challenges of a changing world. So just where we're at. This is over the last century. We're experiencing a hotter climate. Another way of framing that is experiencing more days where temperatures are over 86 degrees Fahrenheit. So there's actually an interactive map. So you can see that thick gray line down the center there. Shows on the left-hand side is historical from 1980 to 2009. We have about 45 days where temperatures reach over 86 degrees. But at the end of this century, we're looking at almost a threefold increase in that under a high emissions scenario. So it's a pretty dramatic difference in what our summers may look like. And anyone growing plants will have experienced in the last 10 years. The zone that I'm growing in currently has shifted. We're moving into zone 7, and the shift that's expected in the next 30 years is on the right here. Regionally, in the Mid-Atlantic region, we're looking at a region that is becoming wetter. Unfortunately, not evenly spread out throughout the year, but warmer air can hold more moisture, so we're seeing more powerful storms. So last year, the remnants of Hurricane Ida really exceeded all past flood amounts in areas around the Brandywine Valley where Longwood is. And those more intense storms are compounded by having more impervious surfaces, which sort of can magnify storm intensity. So just looking at everything red there is impervious surfaces. Anyone who has property in areas where deer roam freely is probably experiencing increased deer pressure. From the 1970s to now, there's been a dramatic increase in deer pressure. And then invasive pests. So most recently, spotted lanternfly. Beech leaf disease is becoming an issue. Emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid. And while not an invasive species per se, the southern pine beetle is native to North America. However, its range has been expanding northward. And one way that warming climate can compound the damage done by some pests, if you're a stressed out plant because it's hot outside, you're more vulnerable to pests. But also, if you're a pest and you have more warm days, you can get in more generations. So southern pine beetles can have anywhere between 3 to 9 generations in a single year, which is pretty dramatic difference, depending on how much warm weather they have to grow and thrive in. So in the United States, about 3 out of every 10 plant species is threatened. And I've highlighted 2 plants here that Longwood has been involved in, our research and conservation team. Actually, just this morning, I was planting some glade spurge, Euphorbia purpurea, not to be confused with Euphorbia amygdaloides cultivar purpurea. That gets really confusing. Different species, beautiful native plant that is rare and threatened throughout its range, which includes Pennsylvania and New Jersey, by deer browse, stilt grass, other things may be affecting it. And then on the right, we have the lovely dragon's mouth orchid, Arethusa bulbosa, which is endangered in Pennsylvania and threatened in New Jersey. And Longwood has been involved in monitoring the populations of and trying to help conserve them. So, okay, that was a lot. All the climate change, threatened species, but my focus of our chat here this evening is what you can do to make a difference, and you can make a huge difference, even on 1/7 of an acre. And I use that number because that's approximately the size of my home landscape, including the house. So yeah, this is a picture of my side yard, very layered, lots of stuff going on. And it is in the summer and throughout the year teeming with life. I get snakes and toads and blue solitary wasps. And I'm hoping that this evening you take away some tools and overall strategies, thinking creatively about, I hope I inspire you to think creatively about your landscape and don't underestimate your potential impact. My main push here tonight is to try to give you a yes and approach. I may be suggesting certain things that maybe they'll work for you, maybe they won't, but to kind of explore all the possibilities. So, so how do you decide where to start? When looking at those climate change models of what our climate and what this area is going to be like in 100 years, I always think first of slower growing canopy trees and planning for the forest that I want to see here in 100 years, because and trying to make sure some of the individuals in that forest are going to be happy here in 100 years, because you can't build an insta forest. It takes some time. And then also looking to species in threatened habitats as species to target, whether they're threatened by development, deer browse, or other factors. So I also think about what plants can't move faster than climate change. If you're a plant whose seeds spread on the wind, you can probably travel pretty far. And if birds eat your fruit and deposit them, you know, you can make some strides, yeah, and travel pretty far too. But if you're relying on squirrels, or if you're relying on ants to spread your seeds, so the image on the bottom right-hand corner is a trillium in my yard with ants coming to collect the seeds with their lyosomes and plant them, you are not going to move very fast every year. And then when it comes to looking at the plants I bring into my home landscape, some nurseries, if just thinking about provenance, where the plant is coming from. So just because you're getting a plant from a local nursery doesn't mean that the seed stock came from there. And a lot of nurseries, growers, or if you're going to, you know, native plant sales at nature centers and that sort of thing, sometimes they can tell you where the seed is coming from. And so for me, I am planting species both from local stock. So I'm growing some Quercus bicolor this year, some swamp white oaks, and I'm getting some from local seed stock from a local nursery. And I've also ordered some from further south that's coming from a more southern species. And I want to add that genetic diversity. Maybe some of those plants coming from further south will be better adapted to the increased heat we're expecting. And there's a lot of species that are self-sterile. So if you're planting populations with an intent of, I mean, if you like the plant and you want more of it, instead of just getting clonal spread, if it is a self-sterile species, making sure you're getting individuals that are genetically unrelated. And sometimes that's just a matter of getting plants from different places, from different growers. And then you can see all the genetic variability within a species. So in Peirce's woods, a lot of the rhododendrons were grown from seed, and you could see even within a species, all the differences in floral color and shape. And I think it made it more interesting too. So it's also aesthetically more interesting. And then I need to emphasize reputable sources. You definitely, you definitely do not want to add biodiversity to your garden by removing it from someplace else. So just Longwood is committed to not purchasing any wild source plants and purchasing from reputable sources. So, all right. So let's dive into some of the resources that I want to share with you this evening. This is just sort of an overview that I'm going to go into detail on plant communities, species range visualization, what trees might do well here in the future, and comprehensive plant lists. So, and these are by no means all the tools in the toolbox, but these are some that I use both in my home garden and in my work in land stewardship and ecology. So starting out with, what is a plant community? So plant species often occur together due to shared environmental requirements. And in plant community descriptions, you can find useful information about not only what the species composition is, what the soil is like in those areas. There'll often be a focus on rare species in a particular community. So those might be ones that you would want to target as, oh, I definitely want to protect rare species. So those are the ones that you definitely want to make sure you're getting from reputable sources. So if I see someone selling native orchids and trilliums on the side of the road for $5 a pop, I'm probably gonna not be buying from them. Let's see. So yes. So a way of looking at plant communities. Longwood Gardens did a plant community delineation of 230, and we led by our Longwood's Associate Director of Land Stewardship and Ecology, Dr. Leah Johnson, led this work of delineating these 213 distinct plant communities. And in her words, we weren't being super splitty about how we lined out these communities. So all the lines you see between different spaces in our map, those are all different plant communities. So, and tangential to, or a segue from plant communities, this is the community that I'm a part of within the larger community of Longwood Gardens, and that's the Land Stewardship and Ecology team here. We all have our various specialties. And so, yes, Dr. Leah Johnson, Joe Thomas, Christy Lane Anderson, myself, Tabitha just joined our team, and Ryan Pardue. And a whole bunch of wonderful students and volunteers. So, and some of the initiatives that we're involved in, research, land management, we're doing a lot of developing and testing different stewardship practices, things we're working on right now, how to manage stiltgrass and garlic mustard and reforestation projects. So yeah, engagement and education. All right, let's go back to plant communities, leave my community. So every single state has, as part of a larger US National Vegetation Classification Initiative, has natural heritage programs where they delineate their ecological communities. So this is the website that will take you to see New Jersey's natural communities, natural plant communities. So if you scroll down this page, it took me a little while to find it initially because they have both of the published plant community works available, the one in 1989 and they have the one from 2001. So if you wanted to look how it changed, you could flip between the two, but if you click on the link with 2001, and there is a third one that is planned, it'll take you to this. And under headings that sort of briefly describe the communities. So whether it is forested and wet, or forested and more dry, or open and sunny, or swampland, there's such it goes through many different sorts of communities. So how do you use these plant communities? So a lot of times when people are looking for plants for their home landscape, they're looking for those lists. It's like top 10 plants for a dry, shady place, because you have that spot on the north side of your house that never gets sunshine and is a little bit high and dry, or top 10 plants for a rain garden. But if you want to get more comprehensive plant lists, thinking about those areas in terms of plant communities that they're similar to can get you to think about other species of plants that are native that would also work in those areas. So because these plant community delineations talk about sun, water, and soil, they are useful for large-scale ecological restoration, for selecting plants that should do well together, but it also works on a smaller scale. So this is just focusing in on the top part, the concept for one of these plant communities on the New Jersey site is seasonally flooded temperate or subpolar grassland. So Calamagrostis canadensis, seasonally flooded herbaceous alliance. So you have a number of herbaceous plants, and I do hope that you don't live on a property that is where the entirety of your property is seasonally flooded. But most of us have gutters, and if you have a poorly drained area by a gutter or a rain garden, think of this as somewhat analogous to that. Just be aware that these plant community descriptions do include non-native species, because that's what people are finding in these areas. So I have highlighted in red Phalaris arundinacea, the reed canary grass, not native, wouldn't recommend putting it in your landscape. But there's a whole grouping of shrubs, Viburnum nudum, the swamp haw, Ulmus incana, Ulmus seriolata, Viburnum dentatum, Spirea alba. So if you look up those different shrub species, oh, these are all the shrubs I could maybe plant by that gutter. So to take that another step, and when you're thinking about plant communities, and because your yard may be disturbed enough, it doesn't necessarily have, it might have remnants of a plant community. So you could use those plant communities to look at, oh, I'm seeing some of these plants in my landscape. Maybe my landscape fits into this plant community that's being described here. Or you could look at the soil and be like, yeah, the soil and sunlight, this feels like the plant community description. I just don't have any of these plants there yet. And here's a plant list that I could maybe work with. But particularly in urban areas, and moving forward with the shifting of zones, hardiness zones, we're looking at in urban heat zones can often be a whole zone warmer, because you have all of these surfaces that absorb heat all day, radiate heat. And so it sometimes makes sense to look for plants from further south, from warmer regions, further south, but not necessarily up in the mountains. So this picture I have here shows that Georgia shares 3 of the plant communities that encompass both Pennsylvania and New Jersey. They share Valley and Ridge, Piedmont, and Coastal Plain. And all of these larger plant communities are detailed in the plant community descriptions. So each state kind of manages their natural plant community data individually. So the websites do not look uniform. This is what Georgia's biodiversity portal looks like. And you would click on, so I mention that because Georgia is sort of at the southern end of the Appalachian Range. It's the beginning of the Appalachian Trail, and there's a lot of species that from throughout that range that were pushed south by glaciation that are hardy back in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Let's see, but maybe threatened in Georgia as the climate continues to heat up. And so in Georgia's natural communities and associated rare plant and animal species, I really like their layout. Okay, so this is the worst PowerPoint slide ever, but I post this to show you just how much information is in a single natural community description. It covers the main species, and I do like the way Georgia puts theirs out there, because they use both common and Latin names, so I do think it makes it more accessible. And they kind of rate the conservation, how high priority different habitats are, and they focus on the rare plants within each of those areas. So moving on from that very dense slide, you could go to any state and look at their plant communities. And another tool, especially whenever I find out about a new plant or I'm like thinking about a genus, I love the species range visualization of BONAP. So the Biota of North America program. You can go through their website, bonap.org, or you can simply, in most search engines, just tap in BONAP space, the genus of the plant you're interested in, and it will give you, so Peirce, I want to look at oaks, and this is just a small section because there's so many oaks. It will show you the range of every oak species pretty much that is in North America, native and non-native. So dark green shows that it's native in a state. The light green shows that it's present but not rare. Yellow means it's rare. The bright green, the chartreuse green, is it's present in a county. The yellow is it's rare in a county. And blue indicates it is an introduced species. So you can quickly do a visual, like see, oh, these are native ones, this is where they are. So yeah, green, native to North America. So to look at, say, two species, Pinus strobus and the northern white pine, which is one that is fairly common at Longwood Gardens in our landscapes, and one that is not common in our landscape. Pinus strobus, it looks like we're kind of at the southern end of its range in Chester County and in areas of Jersey where we're at our altitude. So if you stay up in the mountains where it's colder, yes, it does go further south, but the Smoky Mountains stay cooler year round than the lowlands in Pennsylvania. Whereas the loblolly pine, Pinus taeda, is native like just south of us. It is coming up and is rare in the southern tip of New Jersey. So doing the same thing with birches. Here are some popular birch species. So the paper birch, well, it doesn't really exist in my county anymore, and it's all north of me. I'm not necessarily going to remove ones that are currently growing in the landscape, but I'm probably not going to be looking at adding any more. Betula lenta grows south of us, but more in the mountains, but really far down in the mountains and down. So I am going to plant it, maybe not everywhere, and I'm going to think about where I site it. And then river birch, Betula nigra. Hey, it's all the way down along the Gulf Coast, but it's native up here. I see it has a lot of, it's probably going to be good for a while. So added to that, so that's if you want to look at ranges within genus, but if you want to look at sort of all the species and what trees may and may not do well here in the future, the Climate Change Tree Atlas that can be found in the USDA and US Forest Service Climate Change Resource Center, you can look at specific regions of the United States. So the Mid-Atlantic Piedmont region, and you can sort, it's completely sortable. It's a spreadsheet, so you could search by common name, Latin name. You could search by species that are currently absent or currently common. And I do like that they use multiple scenarios for what we're looking at in climate change, both a low and a high emissions scenario. So you kind of know the range of what the impacts might be. So looking specifically at, so let's bring back Eastern white pine, Pinus strobus. It is, its abundance is common. And so that's line 80. But its outlook is poor and very poor. Whereas other species of pine, such as the Pinus taeda, which I mentioned, this kind of affirms that the loblolly pine, while currently considered rare in this region, is looking good in the future here. It is, this atlas is limited to like 125 species. So it is not a comprehensive look at species, but it's sort of a way of thinking about things. But I say that all that with a large grain of salt. I don't think it's a good idea to just write off species off, at least for me. I don't like to say, oh, yeah, no more of this species. One of the very first plants that I planted as a student at Longwood about 19 years ago was an American elm tree, and it was the first American elm that we'd reintroduced to the garden since Dutch elm disease. And while this isn't a tree that was disappeared from the landscape necessarily due to climate change, it just sort of taught me, you know, we have success stories, and things don't, and our models are not perfect. They're very useful, but there's a lot of, when I went through the challenges of climate change and all the challenges we face, they interrelate in ways that we can't always know exactly how it's going to turn out for every species. So this is the American elm that greets you as you enter the gardens at Longwood, and it survived Dutch elm disease. So I do like using tools like the vulnerability assessment atlas and those range maps when siting plants to think about what they're going to want. So if you're a species at the edge of your range, you're going to do best if you're sited in what is the least stressful spot to you. So on the left, we have Acer pennsylvanicum, the striped maple. This is in my front yard. My front yard is shady all day long. It's a cool space. And this is a species that is at the southern end of its range. It would probably prefer to be in the mountains of Pennsylvania, but I have sort of a microclimate there that it is doing well in. And it's beautiful. And then on the right, yes, not native, but so ornamental horticulture has been doing this, is always pushing the boundaries of what is possible when it comes to hardiness zones. And for the common fig, which you'll see all over when I go into Philly, into the Italian market, there's very happy fig trees because of the heat island of all the paved surfaces in the city. And so this sited out further from the city, but surrounded by blacktop, south-facing exposure. That's sort of what you think of when you are putting, when you have a plant that's at the northern end of its range. You want to shelter it from winter winds, but you also want to find that spot in your landscape that's going to be cozier for it. Maybe mulch it a little more heavily. I have a fig at home that I mulch quite a bit so that it doesn't get too cold in the winter. So the final tool of plant selection that I wanted to go over with you is, for completionists, I like to see total lists of things. So the USDA plants database is a great resource for that. And so you USDA plants.usda.gov, and you can do a state. You can search by state and then break it down by county. And I know that one of the chapters of the Native Plant Society of New Jersey was doing a tour today in the, and forgive me if I mispronounce this, the Lorimer Sanctuary. And so I just, for fun, I looked up, you know, what county is that sanctuary in. And so it's in Bergen County in New Jersey. And you can sort by, okay, just plants native to the lower 48 states, because it will show you introduced species as well if you want. But I was like, I just want to see plants native to Bergen County, New Jersey. And there's over 2,000 records. That's a lot. That's a lot to go through. And maybe I don't have all day to look through it. Maybe I just want to see the ferns that are native to Bergen County. So you could sort by not only nativity status, but plant habit. And so there are 94 fern records in Bergen County. So I could check out all the species of ferns there are. And many of them have photos, as you can see on the right there. And you can sort this by common or scientific name as well. So to get more specific, plants that species I'm excited about right now, 4 species I'm excited about that I grow. So I haven't just read about these. In fact, I'm planting 2 more of these tomorrow in the Forest Walk. Torreya taxifolia, the Florida nutmeg. It's got some great common names: stinking cedar, gopher wood. This is an evergreen understory tree, which we don't have a lot of options for that. As far as native trees go, Ilex opaca, the eastern holly, is pretty much the main one for understory where we are. So you can see its range is primarily just in the Florida panhandle, where it is very rare. It's actually endangered. Another thing I love about this plant is it is, and I hate to say deer proof, because deer always prove you wrong when you say that, but it looks soft like an English yew, but it's actually quite prickly, and it is pretty darn close to deer proof. The one word of advice: it is an understory tree, and it will burn if you grow it out in the sun. So I am planting this tomorrow on a north facing moist slope, likes a little bit of moisture. Another very popular tree in the South, Ilex vomitoria, the Yaupon holly. This is the plant to grow if you want to grow your own caffeine source. If you've had yerba mate, that is also from an Ilex species, from a holly in South America. Ilex vomitoria, the leaves do contain caffeine, and it's another evergreen option. You can see where it's growing in this picture. It's a very moist area, so it can handle wet soils, and it provides fruit for the birds. So caffeine for me, fruit for the birds. Evergreen, and on this, it's a small tree, not a canopy tree. So it sort of has a texture of, say, a Ilex glabra, the inkberry holly, but is a little more upright. Next plant, Phacelia bipinifida, the fernleaf Phacelia. I mentioned this plant specifically because I feel like plant lists and nurseries often overlook biennial species. And so this is a species that in its second year of growth, it flowers, it puts out seed, and then the main plant dies. Its strategy is the next generation perpetuating the species. And so one of the areas I'm planting this in, or I'm spreading seed in of this, is an area that occasionally gets parked on when the arborists need to do some tree work. And I don't want to plant something with like, I can't plant shrubs or plants with crowns that if they get crushed, they die. But these can kind of move around, and where the tires don't get them, they'll spring up and spread around. They're lovely. You want to make sure you don't deadhead them, because then you lose the next generation. So a related species to this is that I have in my home garden that's a little bit shorter, and you can see they do get a little tired when they're done blooming. They turn yellow because they're putting everything they've got into their seeds. Is Miami mist, which does not grow in Miami, Florida, but is named for the Miami River and the Miami people. Phacelia Peircei. So I like this one a lot too. Like I said, a little bit shorter. Both are quite nice. And then Nevusia alabamensis, Alabama snow wreath, is fantastic. I think this is a really beautiful shrub. You can see from the range map that it is rare in all parts of its range. And it has spirea vibes to me. It is in the same family as spirea. It's in the rose family. It has these fluffy white flowers. And this is, let's take this species and go back, and I'll show you how to use the plant communities that I talked to you about earlier in this, when in reverse, like you see a plant that you're like, oh, that's interesting. I might want to protect this plant and grow it in my yard because it's beautiful. And also, there's not a lot of it out there. So where does Nevusia grow? So I'm looking at it, it exists in Georgia. So where does it grow in Georgia? And on the community, in the plant communities, it says mesic hardwood forests. So a wet hardwood forest. And guess what also grows in wet hardwood forests? When I look at the rest of this list, plants of special concern, hey, Miami mist, Phacelia Peircei. Hey, maybe I could grow these together. Let's look at the rest of the plants on this list. But then just doing Control F to see where. So what I like about the PDFs for looking at all of these plant communities online is just doing a Control F search of the document. So when I want to see every time a species is mentioned, I don't have to flip all over, and I can just sort through. So the other two plant communities that Nevusia shows up are, so not just wet forests, but also dry calcareous forests and calcareous cliffs. Both of those soils of that type have relatively high pH, which is interesting if you live in an urban area, because concrete building materials tend to raise soil pH. So maybe that azalea keeps turning yellow because you just can't get the soil to be acidic enough for it. Maybe try Nevusia. It might be the Alabama snow wreath might be happier in that spot. Just, you know, an option. So we just went over considering adding what future adapted species to our region. For me, it's a yes. I'm not growing in a pristine wilderness. And the next component of this is fortifying some of our existing landscapes. So building resilience in existing landscapes. So this is Peirce's Park. You can see these are very old hemlock trees lining Peirce's Park, because I think it's the yes and is we might want to think about adding things that are threatened further south and helping them out, but then also preserving what we have. So, and this can tie into strategies for dealing with increased storm intensity. So these are all the things we want to accomplish when we're dealing with storms, probably. You know, rain gardens, rain barrels, green roofs, all great things. I'm going to try to talk about a couple of things that have worked well for me in a woodland garden that maybe don't always get touched on. So especially working on a site that has years and years of soil compaction from heavy land use, from millions of feet walking over it and lawnmowers and whatnot. Looking at the root zones of my existing trees, how do I de-stress these trees? Giving them a little bit more breathing room by alleviating soil compaction. Oh, and on this younger tree, you can see the white line is where I was bringing the killing the turf back to bring out the bed lines, because that tree is going to grow. So I want to anticipate that when I'm creating space for it. And throughout our highly compacted soil areas, so this is not a solution for the home gardener, but we use air spades, which is just running air through a pressurized tube, which you can use to loosen up heavily compacted soils without damaging tree roots. You can't use a tiller around tree roots unless you really don't care about the trees. And then we backfill those holes with organic matter. So, and what that does is when we get one of those heavy rains in the summer where the soil's gotten really dry, instead of just all the rain hitting hard, dry soil, it's like all of these little straws of compost or pine bark mulch that can help get the water to actually infiltrate instead of just running off and recharging the groundwater and reducing the amount of runoff there is. So some thoughts for what you can do in the home landscape. And I've used the option on the left. I really like, broad fork. All right. The item on the left is a broad fork, and you can stand on it and you can wiggle it and you can get air down into compacted soils. And I like to spread compost and use it to then work that down in. Or I have also seen this done planting daikon radishes. Daikon radishes grow really, really long. You don't harvest them, you just leave them. And when they rot there, they create those tubes of organic matter that can help bust through hard compacted soils. It also helps to have a small army of wonderful volunteers to help you plant living mulch, which plant ground covers like Christmas ferns or plants to hold the soil to reduce erosion, and bulky ground covers can help slow water flow. I was having a lot of runoff problems off of the LA because the trees, there were just tree rings. And then the ferns take about 3 years to grow in fully, and they really slow the water down. So living mulch. Also, it helps shade the roots of the trees to have these ground covers, and it reduced people walking through those areas. So another strategy for slowing water flow down, which I have a resource that goes into more detail on this, because so one thing a lot of people do is build rain gardens as a place for water to go. But once again, if you can't dig because you have tree roots, placing hugelkulturs, which is literally just hill culture in German, to make speed bumps for water. So when a tree falls in the woods and rots, that's what we're mimicking. We're making these, I'm making these glorified compost piles in areas where I routinely get washouts, where I can't get plants on the slope to fully establish because they keep getting wiped out by rainstorms. I tactfully put hugelkulturs in place to help slow the water flow. This will not manage massive amounts of like the kind of work that a civil engineer would do, but on a small scale, this can be very effective. And not only that, it can alleviate stress for plants by making, if you don't have topsoil, a lot of homes just have had in recent development, they strip all the topsoil off and sell it when they're building a new home. So these, like I said, glorified compost heap, you can make that rich, moist, well-drained soil that all the plants that you want to grow want, pretty much. And by having a lot of rotten wood, you can feed beetles, which feed woodpeckers, and support at least woodland systems are very fungal based soils, and rotting wood is like food for the fungus. So this is sort of the bones of a hugelkultur. And then filling them in with wood chips, compost, and here's one freshly planted. Just be aware that because it's a compost pile, expect the first year, even if you pack it in really tight, which you should do, because otherwise it could become an attractive place for rodents to make a home. So pack it in tight, and it will still sink by about 1/3 the first year, just through decomposition. And you can make them very naturalistic, where they blend into the landscape pretty quickly, or you can really make them very ornamental. I think it's really nice in a landscape that's pretty flat. It can add another dynamic, a dimension to your landscape, in addition to helping with things like slowing stormwater. Both these images were taken at Chanticleer. Bell's Woods has a lot of hugelkulturs on display. All right, how am I doing? Whew. All right, so the last component that I want to talk to you about is, well, what are we doing all this for? So we've got consider, depending on your landscape and how you feel about it, looking at future adapted plant species, and fortifying existing landscapes by making the plants that are happy, they're as happy as possible, because we're not going to cut down 100-year-old trees because they're getting a little stressed out. We want to help them out. But also boosting ecological function. Plants are not the only creatures affected by climate change. We all are. And this is a fairly famous map, the Nature Conservancy. Each one of those lines is showing mammals, birds, and amphibians that are being sort of where they'll have to move to find the habitat that they are suited to. And just because they may need to move to a place doesn't mean they will, but trying to be as hospitable as possible and supporting as many creatures as possible is another way of looking at your landscape. So this is when all of those lists come into play. So like 10 best species for pollinators, or Doug Talamay's like comprehensive lists of larval host species lists, flowers for hummingbirds, all of those things, plants for habitat. I just think of it as a buffet. Just try to feed everyone you can. And like I mentioned with the climate change models, know that we don't know everything, that there are a lot of like plant animal interactions that we don't fully understand. And so designing from wildlife's perspective. So here are some, some of many strategies you can employ when, and this is sort of layered on top of when I'm looking at adding plants. I do think about ecological function, thinking about whether they're going to create habitat. Are they, if you go out to your yard and just sort of connecting the landscape physically, especially in woodlands, having shrubs, trees, and ground covers that kind of create conductivity between the canopy and the ground layer can be very helpful. But then also going out to your landscape and, hey, if you don't have anything blooming, but it's a time of year that pollinators might be active, and some of our pollinators start in like March on a warm day, or could be even earlier, visiting some skunk cabbage. If you don't have anything blooming, you might not have any food for your pollinators. So maybe that's that you look at temporal layering. And so my final tool that I want to share with you that's really useful for this, like creating temporal layers in the landscape, is the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center combination search, which you can use to specifically, you can search by state. So you can't do county granular by county, but you could search by New Jersey, could choose the habit of the plant, and then you can choose specifically what month you want it blooming in. So I stepped outside today, September, nothing was blooming. So I could choose September, I could choose the color, I could choose the height, and it'll come back at me with, all right, I've got a sunny spot, it's moist, I want it to, I need something blooming in September, and it needs to be between 1 and 6 feet. I could narrow that more if I wanted. And I get 20 results. So many options. So this is, and you click on any of those options and it brings up a plant profile that is very user-friendly and gives you more information on the plant. So if I have a specific niche that I'm looking to fill, this can be a good way to find the plant for that niche in my home landscape. All right, so thank you for coming with me on this ride, and with some of these ideas for a changing world. So and the takeaway message I have, and why I ended with buffet landscaping, is, you know, let's all be good hosts for all the creatures in need of a new home. So yeah, and the many people who kind of helped me with feedback and images on this.
Awesome. Pandora, thank you. Oh my God, that was so dense and wonderful. And lots of chat here, appreciating the resources and how they can look things up. We do have some questions. Let's talk about plant communities to start. Some of the folks are wondering, do I use what I understand the existing plant community is, and how do I know what that existing plant community is? Or do I create it in my garden or in my landscape?
That's a really good question. And it kind of depends on how much energy you want to put into your landscape and what is possible in a landscape. So some people's home landscapes have rules about, like, so I have an area of my yard where I have very low wires. I cannot turn that into woodland. It will interfere with the wires that are directly above. So I'm going to look at plant communities that are open, not woodland plant communities for that. So when looking at my home landscape, I have 1/7 of an acre, and I would say I have at least 4 distinct plant communities, possibly more if I was getting more splitty about it. So and for me, I really didn't have any native plant community present when I moved in. So I was looking at more the soil and the other site considerations, where there were wires, where there weren't. I had a street tree in the front, and the front yard was already pretty shady. So that's where I did my woodland plant community based on, you know, it's kind of upland. It's in some areas, except for where the gutter lets out. So then I have sort of a seasonally wetter spot. I have a dry south facing slope, but so I think for a lot of disturbed landscapes, looking at the plant communities will talk about the soil characteristics and whether it's open, basically how wet or dry it is, how sunny or shady it is. And that is a useful way of determining what plant communities may work for you. If you're fortunate to have a landscape where you have some remnant, or you have things seeding in that maybe are in some of those plant communities, that can be a hint to help also lead you to some of those other plant communities. And I'm not sure I made it totally clear, but the plant communities in New Jersey, some of them identical plant communities or very similar can be found down in Georgia.
Yeah, so one of the questions relates to that. How do I know what how do I know what plants that may not be native to New Jersey will work in New Jersey? And if I can add to that, how do we not know that they may become invasive in New Jersey, that they may thrive here? So is it a bargain with the devil here, or is it something that's fairly legit and they're just going to do well like they do in their home turf?
Okay, so that is a very good question. And so I guess I'll answer it in two parts. How to know if they'll do well. I mean, you can use botanical gardens as a resource if they are growing them successfully. I like to use the Bone app, the like range visualizer, to give me a sense of where those plants can be found. Knowing that some can go further north, but that if they only exist in the bottom of Florida, probably not. But the upper range of northern part of, if they're existing in the northern part of Georgia, putting them in a sheltered area here where I live in Pennsylvania, especially in a sheltered but yet south facing, like against my house on the south side. I know people who grow colocasia elephant ears on the south side of their house, and they keep coming back year after year. Not native, but it is warm enough now to be able to do that. But my general attitude is to use those range visualizers and the other layers of what I'm looking for to add to my landscape, like feeding certain larval host species. But then I throw a lot of stuff at the wall and see what sticks. I don't expect every plant I put in the ground to live. But then how do you know that they won't become invasive? And that is a very good question. And so, you know what, I might be a little more restrained if I didn't live in a densely populated area where I don't when it comes to invasive pests and things impacting the species that are here now, I see maybe not species being subtracted, but reduced. So hemlocks, hugely reduced in our area. Beeches with this beech leaf disease, I don't know how they're going to be impacted. Chestnuts, almost entirely extirpated. We're bringing them back though. We have some that we're resistant ones that we are reintroducing to the landscape. And we've had some from the Chestnut Foundation. But as we lose or have fewer of our native plants, what moves into those spaces? And by and large, a lot of the times, it's invasive species. So are we introducing species that will work for critters already on the East Coast who may be moving up the eastern seaboard? Is that better than Phragmites? I would say yes.
So it's a calculated risk. You can't guarantee, but it's a calculated risk.
It is.
Yeah.
And I like to see it as, I don't know, maybe not a rescue mission, but I think in a home landscape, you can pay the kind of attention to a plant that a lot of times land stewards have hundreds of acres to watch over. And while you can have deer exclosures and you can have areas where you focus on plants that require more care and attention, creating sites where with greater genetic diversity of plants that are threatened, especially plants that are, I just think you can do that in a more, searching for the right word, and just like a closer, more intimate, like you're really caring for this plant sort of way in a home landscape.
Right.
But I am not telling anyone that they should pull plants from further south. I'm just trying to say that it is a thing I have been doing in my home landscape, and that I'm looking for southern populations of existing species in our highly impacted area of Longwood. If you wanted to use these tools and just look for threatened species that exist in your county and find microclimates in your yard to support those species, and use plant communities as a guide to like help you find the right spot for them, that's good too. If that feels what's right for you.
Mhm. So just to reinforce, the plant community is about how much sun, how much moisture, how much water, and what type of soil you have. Can you use the national wetland indicators to help with the moisture and soil question?
Yeah, like the different plant communities will also say like seasonally flooded versus, you know, some of them are found more by rivers, seepages. Did that answer your question? Yeah,
So
I guess a wetland.
So when you were talking about
Yes.
your home and 4 communities, one is shady out front, one is sunny along the back, and then you have kind of part sun, part shade in between your neighbor's house. And then the soils, are they different? Is the water different in each of those areas? And then someone asked about the wetland indicators. Can they add that to the tool of determining the plant community?
You certainly can. How water moves through your landscape definitely is different plant communities are found in wet or upland situations, and trying to think, the part relating to my yard, the question relating to my yard was,
Just, you said you had 4 communities and you were describing how
yes.
you kind of determined what they were.
So yeah, the south facing side of my house is very dry. I've got wires above, so I'm not planting trees in that area. So I'm treating it as like more of like a sunny grassland, herbaceous, like a mix of forbs and grasses. Front yard, I'm treating as a woodland, because there's a street tree there, and my house shades that part of the yard for half the day, and the tree shades it for the other half. North side of my house, a lot of people, the north side of their house is because most people's homes are plant your house. Sorry. Most people's houses are placed high because you don't want water draining towards your house, ideally. So a lot of times the north side of the house is sort of a dry upland woodland. And that can be, so yeah, like a dry woodland.
Okay.
that never sees the sun.
A couple more before we go. How long does it take for the hugel to decompose? Will it become loamy? Does it take years? Is it a season? Do you have to rebuild it again?
So they do over time kind of melt into the landscape a little bit, just the way, and it depends on the wood you put in. Like a harder hardwood, it's going to take longer to decompose. A white oak falls in the forest, it's going to take a long time for it to break down. A birch falls, it's going to rot a lot faster. So your base materials. Oh, I was going to also mention, maybe you don't have a landscape with a lot of extra wood. I also don't have a ton of trees on my property, and I'm not cutting down trees to make hugel cultures. Every time I go to the city, our township has like a compost pile, and I will go there and pick through the wood. I'm careful to try to choose logs and branches that don't appear to be diseased or have insect damage, but I always end up taking home more than I drop off there, always. And I like picking out like a nice, to make it really decorative, I'll look for like logs with lichens or, you know, decorative elements. I would say if you have a yard that's devoid of topsoil, you could build a hugel culture in an area where you need it. And then as it melts into the landscape, the topsoil that you've built should stay there. It just sort of will flatten out over time. Build a hugel in another area that needs some work and needs some good topsoil.
Okay, awesome. Quick one, native versus nativar/cultivar, preferences, opinions about that?
That's a question that always comes up, I bet. So in home landscapes, a lot of times it's helpful to plant cultivars that are more compact if you don't have a lot of space. However, if you're growing cloned cultivars, you're not getting that genetic diversity. And if you're growing species that are self-sterile, so like off the top of my head, like pawpaws, self-sterile, you're never going to get any fruit on them if you only grow the cultivar Susquehanna. And that means you're not going to be getting any genetic diversity in offspring. So I would, if I had room to plant, if I needed a short one up front, like along a walkway, I would see if there was a species. I might see if I could get a straight species that's taller where I need something that is a little bit taller so that I get some cross-pollination and genetic diversity coming out of that. As I've been working with native plants, I have moved away from cultivars that have non-standard foliage colors like deep purple, or plants that I worry if I am growing plants, because if you're growing plants because you want to support butterflies and moths with larval host species, I know that some of the plants with some of the cultivars that have like a purple leaf when the straight species is a green leaf, those butterflies will either not recognize the cultivar as being its host, or perhaps they can't feed on it. I would like to reduce confusion for pollinators, but I do understand people who want to have, you know, a purple foliage plant in their yard. So I'm not going to tell you what to do in that, but it's just thinking about what your goals are and meeting your goals in your landscape.
Well, I think we got most of the questions. But I think I'll use that as a segue to promote Sam coming next month. I hope you'll join us too, Pandora.
I think I will.
And hear all about the cultivars they're raising there and how well they support, particularly nectar plants. So I want to thank everybody so much for joining us tonight. We're doing something a little new at the end. So once we close this down, there's going to be a survey so you can evaluate the content and beautiful Pandora's work in this webinar tonight. And there will be a link sent by email. So if you don't want to take the time right now, but it'll take all of like 5 minutes. I think there are 4 questions. So have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thank you so much, and come back in October and see Sam and Pandora. Best wishes for planting season. Don't overexert yourself. And I hope everybody will come to Longwood Gardens and see you this spring.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thanks, Mike. Bye all. See you next month.